just the Sembrando Salud 103?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
awesome. Thank you so much. Then we're going to go ahead and get started. If you joined late, we're just getting started, so you arrived at the right time. So, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Sembrando Salud 103. This is our workshop number 3 this season, and we will be presenting about weeds. So first, I'd like to do some introductions. I am speaking right now. I am Daisy Cortes. I work for the Cortes program at the Center of Southwest Culture. I'm coming to you with about 10 years of experience in farming and gardening. So I feel really excited to talk about today's topic and really hope I can be helpful answering any questions that you have. I was also born and raised here in Albuquerque, New Mexico, so I'm pretty familiar with the plants we'll be talking about today. We're waiting for our coworker Tiana, so I'm going to pass the mic over to Rebecca to introduce herself.
Goatsi Hopa at Ikamayami Hano Goekwa Hano. My name is Beck Tutchin. I'm from the Pueblo of Laguna. I've been a part of Sembrando Salud for 4 years now. And so if anybody has questions about the program, I'm glad to answer. And thank you very much for everyone being here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rebecca. And please feel free to chime in at any point if you have things you want to add. Oops. Okay. Oh, having a crazy tech moment here. One moment. Okay. So first, I just wanted to share with you all that there are a number of places that you can connect with us. If you go to YouTube and search the Center of Southwest Culture, you'll be able to see today's recording as well as all the other workshops we're teaching this year. You can also access previous year's workshops. So that's a really awesome resource. We're also available to connect with you on Instagram, on Facebook, and we have a website for the entire Center of Southwest Culture. And pretty soon here, we will be adding a page to that website. That's just a list of frequently asked questions. So you guys can look for that soon. That will be another really helpful resource. So I'm going to start with just an overview of what our day looks like. I'm going to open up just talking about like what is a weed? How are we defining that in this conversation? We'll go into what weeds can tell us about our soil, where we're growing. We'll have a Q&A session. We'll look at common weeds here in New Mexico. Then we'll have another Q&A session. Then we're going to end our conversation talking about how to manage weeds, what some good practices might look like. And then we'll end with a Q&A and closing. So first things first, I wanted to talk about what is a weed. I think this question is really important because it's very contextual. I am presenting this from a place of someone who actually really loves weeds, and I think they have a lot to teach and offer us. And I also understand that they can be a nuisance in the garden. So what I mean when I'm talking about a weed is it's just a plant that is either taking up a lot of space or outcompeting other plants that we are trying to grow. And so, for instance, the image that I've shared is this plant called goldenrod. Some people would grow this on purpose and see it as a medicinal plant. In other places, it can really like take over an area and make it hard to grow other things. And so in one context, we're looking at it as a plant. In another context, we're looking at it as a weed. So when I use the word weed, I'm mostly using it to talk about common plants that we all know that can make gardening a little bit difficult or be in competition with other plants that we're growing. I'm also going to try to share with you some of the like benefits of weeds, so that we don't just look at them as these bad plants that we want to get rid of. So for instance, to start, we're going to look at the pros of weeds. One weed thing that weeds do really well for us is they keep the soil covered. So if you look out into nature, it's really rare to see the earth just be like completely barren almost anywhere. It's the wisdom of the earth and of natural cycles to keep the soil covered. This is because it protects the soil and it helps keep moisture in the soil. So that's one thing that weeds are doing really well. They're helping to keep soils covered and protected. Another really important aspect of weeds is that they can contribute to biodiversity. The more different species that we have in a garden of plants, the more beneficial insects we're going to attract, more different kinds of animals and birds. And it's having this diverse array of creatures and beings that really gives resilience and strength to an ecosystem or a garden. Another thing we don't always think about that is a gift of weeds is they maintain a living root. And what I mean by that is under the soil where the roots live, it's that root matter that is helping to keep oxygen moving. It's helping to provide food for the microbes that build our soil. And so wherever possible that we can have roots that are living in the soil, it's actually helping us to maintain our soil structure, to keep the soil healthy. And so weeds, by growing so easily, are offering their roots to the soil. Something we're going to go into next is that weeds can teach us a lot about our soil. Weeds are often the plants who are arriving when soil has been really neglected or really disturbed or really overworked. And so they are some of the first plants to tell us kind of the history of a piece of land or what has been going on in a garden and what it might need to improve its health. Lastly, a lot of weeds are actually edible or medicinal plants. Now, anytime we're thinking about harvesting a plant for food or medicine, we really need to be sure we know what we're working with. There's a lot of great resources around town for learning a little bit more about foraging and herbalism. I'm going to teach you a few things today, but I, again, just want to really name that you should make sure you know the plant you're harvesting before you are to consume it. The other thing about this is there's so many weeds that we could be foraging, but one of the hard things about foraging weeds, if we're just out and around town, is we don't always know how those weeds are being treated. A lot of people are spraying weeds with poison. And so I would probably not just pick a weed off the sidewalk. In fact, I wouldn't just pick the weed off a sidewalk somewhere or outside of a public building or even at a park, because I don't know necessarily if that weed has been exposed to poison. And if it has, I don't want to put that in my body. But this is really the benefit of being a gardener, is you have weeds in your own garden. And so if you do become interested in harvesting them for food or medicine, you know what has happened to those plants and whether or not they will be safe for you to eat. And of course, we have to talk about some cons of weeds. So if anyone's been in the garden, these things are probably really obvious. One of the first ones is that weeds are using the same resources as the other plants in our garden. They're using water, they're using nutrients from the soil. And so in that way, they can outcompete other plants. Weeds are often really strong and hardy plants. And so sometimes if they start to take over, it will make it really difficult for other plants to grow. In addition, some weeds are considered invasive. And what I mean by that is an invasive plant is something that comes into an area and takes over. It makes it almost impossible for other things to grow. And that actually is going to limit biodiversity. When we have one plant arriving and taking over a space, that's going to strain the soil. that's going to kill all the other plants around it. So when we see this happening, we definitely are going to want to manage those kinds of plants. And lastly, some weeds can be poisonous, both to humans, pets, and livestock. So that's another reason why we might not want to have them in our garden or around our animals. And for instance, you can see the picture I chose here is a tumbleweed. Tumbleweeds are actually able to excrete some chemicals into the soil that make it hard for other plants to grow around them. So they're an example of a plant that would be considered invasive. It comes into an area, takes over, makes it difficult for other things to grow. My screen is frozen. One moment, please. Okay, we're gonna have to re-enter presentation mode. There we go. Okay. I'm sorry, y'all. My computer got a little frozen, so now we can get back on track. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to talk about with weeds is their root structures. So the roots of different plants can help us understand what is going on in the soil. And if we're pulling a weed all the way out of the ground, it gives us an opportunity to see its root structure. So one of the first things we might see is a weed that has a really deep taproot. So in the image on the screen, you can see that there's a lot of spreading roots, but that there's one central root that is really thick and hardy, and that's called a taproot. And so some plants naturally have really deep taproots, and they are really thick, and they go deep, deep into the soil. These plants are often having a taproot because they're needing to go really deep to access either the water or the nutrients that they need. And so when we see weeds that have a really deep taproot appearing on our land, that's suggesting that the soil might be really compacted. That means that the soil is not having a lot of easy movement. It's hard for oxygen and water to move through it. It's hard, almost like a brick. And so some plants that we'll talk about today that are examples of weeds with deep taproots would include dandelion, kochia, sometimes calitas can have a nice deep taproot. So if you are pulling up weeds, this is something you can look at. And if you're noticing lots of deep taproots, it might tell you that you're dealing with some compaction in your soil, which would mean that it's time to really get more biomatter in there and to help aerate the soil, which some of these plants are trying to help you do. Another root system we might see is spreading roots. Spreading roots, like shown in this picture, would be roots that are just spreading out almost like a big net. And spreading roots are going to help keep soil together. They really do act sort of as a net. And so when we see root systems like this, they might indicate that our soil is experiencing a lot of erosion. So sort of the opposite of compaction. With erosion, it means the soil is so loose, it's just going everywhere. And that means we're losing the nutrients and the things that we need in our soil to grow our plants. An example of a plant with spreading roots is our favorite goat heads. Very pesky plant, but when we notice it arriving, it's a good sign that maybe the soil has some erosion issues going on that need to be addressed. Another thing we might want to look at is grasses. When we notice that grasses are appearing in an area, grasses have these like deep stringy roots, but they also can tend to sort of like link together. That's why we call movements grassroots movements. It's like many individuals coming together. When we see grasses appear in the garden, That can often indicate that soil has been poor, but it's starting to be rehabilitated. So when soil is starting to heal and become healthy again, grasses are some of the first plants that we will see appearing. Another thing we can look at with weeds is whether they have large leaves. I'm going to talk about this plant in a little bit, but this plant is called Quelite or lamb's quarter, and you can see it has really big, luscious leaves. So when we see weeds like this appear in the garden, it's a really good sign. It's telling us that our soil probably has really good fertility. Another benefit of these plants is with their big leaves, they're able to provide shade. And as you all know and have experienced, our summers here in New Mexico are getting hotter every year. The intensity of the sun on our summer gardens can be too much for our young plants sometimes. And so I will often leave a couple weeds like Quelites around the garden and let them get kind of big because they're going to provide shade to plants around them. Plants or weeds with big leaves like this are often edible as well. Another thing we might notice looking at weeds is if their leaves are small and spreading. So in this picture, you can see a photo of goat heads, and you might notice that the leaves are very small and the whole plant is spreading across the surface of the ground. When we see plants like this appear in the garden, it might indicate that the soil is very infertile, it's losing its fertility, and particularly it's losing nitrogen. And these plants are appearing because they're trying to keep the soil covered and protected because it's already becoming vulnerable. So when we start to notice these plants appear in our garden, it might be telling us that we need to give a little more TLC to our soil. Another plant that we can see, or plant feature that we can see that might tell us some interesting things, is when weeds have spiny or spiky leaves. I chose to share a photo of silver nightshade for this image. Some other examples you might think about would include like the tumbleweed we saw earlier, or other thistles that have just a lot of spines and spikes. When we see plants like this, it's telling us that our soil is probably poor, that it's probably been really disturbed. For instance, maybe it's just been tilled too many times without being cared for in between. And it can also suggest erosion. And so these plants are coming in kind of as like last ditch emergency medics. They're making it hard for other plants to grow. And often these spiny and spiky plants do that by actually, spreading like chemicals through the soil that make it harder for other kinds of plants to grow. So when we see a lot of spiny and spiky plants, we know that the soil is going to need a lot of work and care, that something has been going on that has made it really, really difficult to have a healthy plant community there. So that brings us to our first Q&A. I would love to get to hear from people if you want to come off of mute and share your questions out loud. But if you feel more comfortable, you're also welcome to put them in the chat.
So I'll jump right out there. This is Mary. And I find a lot of weeds are great, but one that many people don't consider a weed that I struggle with always is Bermuda grass. I've found it doesn't have much to speak for it. It'll grow through concrete, and I'd like to know how to get rid of it from my garden.
Okay, that's a great question, Mary. And I'm glad you asked that because I'm covering some other grasses. However, I'm not speaking specifically to Bermuda grass. So when it comes to a grass like that, they are extremely resilient. The best thing that you can do is to do a really deep double dig. It's actually a a pretty intense process and it's pretty disruptive to soil. But if it's what we need to do to get out a grass, we'll do it. And so that means like digging deep enough to pull out that initial grass and its root, and then turning that soil, going even deeper to see what other root matter might be left and trying to get all of that out. With grasses, when you just cut them at the top, they grow back. If you cut just part of the root, they can grow back from the root itself. It's really pretty inspiring. But if we don't want them there, it's really difficult to deal with. The other thing that I have done on farms is we will try to pull out as much as we can manually, and then we will cover the soil with a heavy black plastic and leave that for 6 months to a year if it's really bad in a certain area, or even a few months. But that way you're making that soil sort of impossible for anything to grow with all of the heat from the sun and the plastic. So that's another option for Bermuda grass. And otherwise, the hard answer to this question is that you kind of just have to stay on it. And it might be difficult to get it to all ever go away.
So persistence and dedication.
Yeah, and I think, with any management system in the garden, the more that we're out in our garden, the more we're observing what's going on, the more opportunities we're going to have to do things like notice the Bermuda grass when it's really small and easy to get out by the root. So the more that we are present and harnessing our power of observation, that will help a lot too.
Thank you, Daisy.
Thank you, Mary. Does anyone else have questions? And again, if you don't want to share your question out loud, you're welcome to enter it in the chat.
Well, if no one else has one, I'll say that one of the things I find with many weeds, obviously not Bermuda, is so many of the weeds in the garden that I've been told to pull or poison or whatnot, later I find out they're edible. There is food all around us, and it is amazing how many edibles there are. I've even found it's not quite as bad as Bermuda, but the elm trees that we have here, not only do I now eat the seeds that are out right now, which are wonderful and nutty and delicious, but also I've found that the young leaves have more lactobacillus on them than even the things that we generally use to make sauerkraut. And so I make a really yummy kraut out of young elm leaves.
Wow, that is so cool. Thank you for sharing that, Mary. For those who maybe don't know what lactobacilli is, it's like a bacterial strain that helps with good fermentation, like sauerkraut or yogurt. And I'm really glad you mentioned elm specifically, Mary, because we're going to talk about that in the next section where we go into plants. So if no one else has questions for this section, we will go on and start to talk about the plants that we might see in our gardens. All right. Okay, so the first plant we're going to talk about is called wild amaranth. Sometimes it's also known as pigweed. What you'll find with weeds and with a lot of wild plants is that they might have slightly different names depending on your area. And I actually really love that. I know it can create some confusion, but I think that it's part of a folk tradition where people are in relationship with plants and the land in a very specific way that is place-based. So you'll see that I've labeled a lot of these plants as one thing, but I might share multiple names for them, and I'm talking about the same plant. So yeah, in the case of wild amaranth or pigweed, it gets to be really big. It's kind of a huge plant, and it can also be a really intense allergen for a lot of people, which is one reason you might not want to have it in the garden. Its pollen can really, really be a lot for people. But some things to know about this plant, some ways to recognize it. I tried to pick a picture that gave you a really good image of the leaf and of the seed pod. But one of its distinctive characteristics you can see in this picture is that the stem is often like really red. So that's something to look for. The good news for you if wild amaranth is appearing in your garden or pigweed is that that indicates that you have really fertile soil. So if this plant is appearing, that means things are probably going really well. And there's also some benefits to having this plant. For instance, the young leaves are edible, either raw or cooked. And the seeds are also edible, just like the amaranth that, especially the beautiful like red and golden amaranths that we grow for grain. This is their wild relative. And the big difference is just that their seed heads are a lot spikier and harder to work with. It kind of hurt your hands. But this is an edible plant. One thing I will say is that it can spread really easily. So it might be nice to have this plant in your garden before it sets seed because it's providing shade and is edible. But I would probably cut this plant down before it goes to seed and starts to spread itself. Okay, the next plant I wanted to talk about is bindweed. Bindweed looks a lot like a morning glory, but it typically has more of like this white or white and purple flower. Bindweed is a really intense plant to work with. Once it establishes itself, it is very hard to get rid of. So if you see bindweed in your garden, as much as I have love and respect for all plants, I would try to get it out of there. Bindweed, once it's down, it can send its roots really far down into the soil and then grow back from roots. So similar to grass, like once it's really established, it's very hard to get rid of. When it's smaller, it's a little bit easier to get out. And so bindweed also, the reason it's called bindweed is it can send up little coils and actually strangle other plants. And so bindweed is an invasive plant in that it doesn't really cooperate very well with the plants around it. It kind of strangles them out, and it also takes up so much room in the soil that it doesn't leave much space for anyone else to grow. Again, there's always a benefit to a plant. So with bindweed in this picture, you can see the soil around it is all super bare and dry. And so the bindweed is trying to help the earth by covering that soil and helping keep its moisture in. So we thank it for that, but it is a plant that I would get out of the garden kind of ASAP. In our last question section, Mary mentioned Bermuda grass. I didn't talk about that plant specifically, but I did choose to talk about crabgrass. So this is an up close picture of crabgrass, and crabgrass is not so bad to get out when there's just a couple of little plants or it's just getting started. Once it's started to spread and form a really strong root mat with other plants, that's when it becomes very difficult. So as I was addressing in Mary's question, the best thing you can do about grasses is be out in your garden a lot and get them while they're young. If you can catch them at that stage, they're not going to spread as easily, and they're going to be a lot easier for you to work with. Dandelion. So dandelion is a weed I think most people are familiar with, and it's a weed that I actually really don't mind having in my garden. In my experience, it doesn't normally take over a whole area very easily. They grow as individual plants, unlike crabgrass or bindweed, which makes these like root networks. And so it's a lot easier if you don't want this plant in your garden to just go ahead and pull a couple and then you're out of trouble. But dandelion, I want to teach as really a great ally for the garden. It has a really deep taproot, as we talked about earlier, so it's going to help to break up compaction in areas of your garden that might be compacted. Another benefit about dandelion that you might notice if you're looking outside right now is it's one of the first food for pollinators. So I really like to leave these flowers because it's some of the really early food for our friends who pollinate like honeybees or wild bees when they're just coming out of hibernation and they really need food. So dandelion is amazing for the ecosystem in that way. And dandelion is also an edible and medicinal plant. So as you can see in the sort of bottom right of this image, a dandelion leaf is toothed. And so the name dandelion actually it's very similar to the Spanish name for this plant, which is diente de león, which means tooth of the lion. And that name is indicating this sort of like toothed shape of the leaf. So that's a really easy way to recognize dandelion. Its flowers make it fairly easy to recognize. And its seed head, which comes after the flower, I think almost everyone is familiar with. It has those beautiful puffy seeds that we blow and make wishes to spread it everywhere. But it's a pretty easy plant to recognize. And so the leaf is edible. It can be quite bitter, so not everyone loves to eat it, but it's a bitter green, which means that it's very supportive to the liver. The root of the dandelion is a really wonderful root to roast and make into tea. It's a pretty good coffee alternative. It's also supportive to the liver, and in my opinion, it's just very tasty. And it's generally a pretty safe herb. And another thing you can do is eat the flowers. One of my favorite things to do in the spring is if I can find enough dandelions, I want to make sure that I leave enough flowers for the pollinators. But if I can find enough, then I will pick all of the flower petals off of the flower head and I'll mix them together with butter and honey. And it makes this delicious dandelion honey butter, which just tastes like spring and has this like sweet polleny taste of the flower. And so, yeah, I think dandelion is actually a great weed to have in the garden, and I wouldn't encourage you to pull it unless you find it taking over an area. Sort of on the other side of that story is everybody's favorite plant, the goat head. If you've spent any time in New Mexico, you've met this plant. I've put a picture of the seeds in the bottom left. You know that these will be in the bottoms of your shoes. They will hurt if you're walking around in bare feet. They will pop your bike tires. They're really just kind of an incredible nuisance. And so goat head is one of the plants that I really don't like to keep in my garden. It also has some medicinal benefits. Sometimes people will use it as a wash. They'll turn the seeds into a tea to make a wash that helps with itchiness. So this plant does have benefits, but it spreads so quickly and its seeds are such a pain to deal with and, you know, get stuck in your feet and your animals' feet and your kids' feet, that when I see this plant up here, I do want to get rid of it right away. And as we talked about earlier, if goat heads are really appearing a lot in an area, it's indicating that you might not have great fertility in your soil. They're one of those small leafed spreading plants that are telling us that the soil could really use some more nutrients. So before you pull them, you can thank them for their message. This next plant is also sort of a low spreading plant. It's called purslane, or I know this plant as verdolagas. This is a super popular edible plant, especially in Mexico, where my family's from. It is super delicious. It's really high in omega-3s. It tastes really good raw. It tastes really good cooked. But if you want to eat purslane, you need to make sure you know what you're harvesting. So in this picture, you can see that purslane has a very like juicy and fleshy leaf. It has like a succulent quality to it. That's one really good indication that you have purslane. When it's flowering, it has these little yellow flowers. And when you break the stalk or the stem, the fluid is more clear. It's not milky. I'm about to show you a plant that has a milky substance that is not safe to eat. So if you are to break the stem and you see it be really milky, then it's not purslane and you should not be eating it. Purslane is a weed that I also really don't mind having in my garden. Not only is it edible, but it provides a really amazing ground cover to help keep the ground cool and keep moisture in. And it's really not that hard to pull up when it does appear in areas that I don't like. So this is a weed that I really welcome in my garden. I did want to show you a plant that looks very similar to purslane. It's called spurge. You can see it's also spreading and it has a similar shape of leaf. However, spurge leaves are much smaller and they're almost a little fuzzy or hairy. They're not thick and juicy and succulent like a purslane leaf. So they're pretty easy to tell apart, but if you've never seen both plants, I think it's really important to introduce you to their differences. Spurge also, if you are to break a stem of it, it will have a very thick, milky substance, and that is toxic to eat. And so, yes, please do not eat spurge, but I thought I should show it to you because sometimes people mistake spurge and purslane for one another if they weren't aware that both plants exist. Spurge is nice in the fact that it's a ground cover that's not that hard to pull out, but it does spread very quickly. So some gardeners will tell you they don't want it in their garden at all. I feel like a little bit is okay. You have to observe in your own garden and based on your own philosophy and practices if you want to let a little bit of spurge be around or if you just want to take it out whenever you see it. Another grass I thought I should name is Johnson grass. Johnson grass can grow to be super tall, like 3 or 4 or 5 feet tall. Like other grasses, it's really not that hard to deal with when you just have a couple stalks of it. But once it spreads, it can honestly make it almost impossible to grow. So Johnson grass is a plant that as soon as I see it, I'm pulling it out. When I've dealt with bigger patches of Johnson grass, even if it's just a few feet around, I often have to dig into the soil, sometimes like up to 3 or 4 feet. And so that amount of labor is not accessible to all of us, and it's super time consuming, even if it is. So Johnson grass is a plant that if I see, I get it out right away. This next plant is called kochia. You've probably seen this weed around. It can grow to be a couple of feet tall. It has this sort of light green, very fuzzy leaf. Kochia, like pigweed, can be a really intense allergen for people. My partner is super allergic to it. So for that reason, as soon as I see it, I pull it out of the garden. But kochia, I do want to share that it has a leaf that is edible when cooked. Because the leaf is sort of fuzzy and a little dry, it doesn't taste very good raw, but it is an edible cooked leaf. If you're not allergic to kochia, leaving maybe one plant in your garden to provide shade before it goes to seed is a strategy that you can employ, kind of like pigweed. This next plant is called lamb's quarters or quelites. A lot of people here might know it as quelites. It's a wild spinach. And if you look at the shape of the leaf, you can sort of see how it looks a little bit like a spinach leaf. When this plant appears in your garden, it is telling you that you have very healthy soil. So if this weed appears, it's good news for you. It can also get really big and it can spread really easily. So like I've named with kochia or I named with wild amaranth, I like to let maybe a couple of these grow in my garden and I'll harvest the leaves as they're growing. But I don't really like them to go to seed just because they can take over an area. And Also, just be aware they can get very large. So if it's growing next to something and they're kind of close together, you might want to pull it up before it gets really big. Because when it gets really big and its roots are really big, when you pull it, it might also disturb the plant next to it that you're trying to grow. This plant is a plant that we see really starting to take off around town right now. It's one of the first plants that appears in the spring, and it's called London Rocket or wild mustard. This plant spreads really, really easily, and so you definitely want to keep an eye on it in the garden. But some benefits of this plant is, like dandelion, it has a very deep taproot, so it can help with soil compaction. And it also has edible mustard leaves. They can be a little spicy and intense for people, but some folks really love them, especially cooked. So this is a wild mustard that you can harvest and eat from the garden. Oh, silver nightshade. Silver nightshade is a very difficult plant to deal with in the garden, in my opinion, just because it's covered in spines. And so it's just not very fun when you have to pull it. Some things I've noticed about it are that when it grows in the shade, it doesn't have as many spikes and it's a lot easier to pull out. But when I'm working with this plant, I'm definitely wearing gloves. When I get those spines in my fingers, they will irritate me for days and days. And another thing you can do to avoid grabbing the spines is if you get a trowel or a shovel and you dig some of the dirt away from the base of the plant, you can pull it up just from its root because its root doesn't have the spikes on it. Silver nightshade is a plant that when I see it in my garden, I want it out right away. It spreads really quickly. It makes it really hard for other plants to grow around it, meaning that it's quite invasive. And it's also indicating that maybe the soil is overworked or is infertile. So when silver nightshade's appearing, it's a good opportunity to recognize that your garden could really use some more nutrients from compost, mulch, or a cover crop, like growing something that is not going to be as intensive for the soil. And the last plant we're going to talk about, because I want to make sure we have room for questions in our last section, is Siberian elm. So Mary mentioned this leaf, which you can see in the picture, and she shared with us that she uses this leaf to help with like wild fermentation, like sauerkraut. In addition, the young leaves are edible and they have a lot of mucilage. So it's actually like really nice for the digestive system. It coats it with this like kind of thick, goopy mucus, which the digestive system likes. I included a picture of the seeds of the elm, which are called samaras. Right now is samara season. So if you go outside, you can see that the trees, most of them don't really have leaves yet. They just have these little seeds. And these seeds are actually really delicious and really nutritious. They've got tons of minerals in them. So this is another food that you can wild forage if you know that the plant is safe. And I decided to include elm because even though it's a tree and we love that trees provide shade here in the desert, elm can really take over an area. It can disrupt your plumbing systems. It can uproot walls. And so unless you have a ton of space, most of us really need to get elms out before they get big. And the thing about elms is if you're out in the garden and you notice them when they're very small, they're very easy to get out. But if any of you have dealt with elms before, you know that once they get bigger, it can be almost impossible to get them out from the root. And they are an amazingly resilient plant. So if you cut them, they will just keep growing back. They're kind of like a hydra. They'll grow back with more trunks, more stems. So your best approach to elm trees is to get them out when they're really tiny babies. And I know that was probably a lot of information. So if anyone has questions right now, I would love to hear them.
Well, I've got two comments on the weeds that you just showed. One of
Mhm.
my favorite weeds is the dandelion because I find that almost every single part of the dandelion is edible. And you mentioned a number of edible ways with the leaves and the root and the flowers. One of the other things I've found you can do is with the tiny flower buds when it's just a little nubbin. You can harvest those and brine them and then use them very similar to a caper.
Mhm.
Also, just like you fry capers and make them very crispy, you can do the same thing with the dandelion buds, and they taste much the same. They're quite delicious. So I have not yet found an edible purpose for the fuzzy seed head, but I'm still looking for that.
Thank you so much, Mary. You're such a great community resource with your knowledge. And as to my knowledge, there really isn't an edible quality to the seed. And that's okay. Dandelion offers us a lot already.
It does, and who knows, maybe somebody will come up with something. The other thing is the leaf nightshade. So I always found it just as a really irritating weed, but it turns out that the young green seed pods can be used if you crush just a couple of them and run hot water over it. You'll get a mucilaginous liquid from the water. And then that can be used if you're a cheese maker like I am, that can be used as a coagulant like rennet. So if you're looking
Cool.
for a vegan or vegetarian rennet source, silverleaf nightshade is your friend.
Wow, that is so cool. And Mary, I don't want to pressure you at all, but maybe if you're open to sharing your email in the chat in case people have questions about recipes for capers, um, or any of the things you've shared, if you're open to sharing your email in the chat, that would be great.
Sure, I'll be happy to.
Thank you so much. Does anyone else have questions?
I do, Daisy. I'm not
Yeah.
sure if you showed, I have these weeds that have those yellow balls on them,
Mm-hmm.
and they have stickers on them.
Yeah. So those are the silverleaf nightshade.
Okay.
Um, and those are the ones that Mary was just sharing that before those little like seed balls turn yellow when they're just green, that they can be used in cheese making. But yeah, otherwise, that's silverleaf nightshade. And when you see it, it has like a purple flower.
Yes, and I like those. I actually have an area on the side of my house where I just let them grow, but they are evasive. But yeah, it's good to know that I need to pull those.
Well, I also, Beck, I kind of love that you found a place where they can grow because like every living creature like has its place here on Earth. And even if they're really pesky for us, as you've probably noticed, like the pollinators love them. So they are offering benefits to other creatures. But just if you ever wanted to cultivate that area where they're growing now, they're gonna make it a little harder for you in the long run.
Yes,
Um,
I've noticed that. So I plan to start pulling them now, and getting them out of the way because they do. Although they are very pretty, and I like the purple flowers. Um,
mhm.
yeah, they're starting to take over some of the areas where I do have some other plants, like my cactus plants, and I thought they were a form of cactus, so that's good to know.
Yeah. I mean, they kind of look like it with their spikes. I can totally see that.
Right, right. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I really love questions. And I also just wanted to say that if your question isn't clear to you now, but you have a question that comes up later, at the end of this presentation, I'll share our contact info. So please know that if you have a question later, you're welcome to reach out by email or by phone, and we'll do our best to answer all of your questions. So if there's no more questions, I'm gonna just go through the last section, which will be pretty quick, and we'll have time for one more Q&A at the end. So I wanted to talk about how to manage weeds. I mentioned a little bit about this with each individual plant, but I just wanted to end this presentation by talking more generally. So one management strategy is collaboration. It's working with weeds. And in this strategy, you let some weeds grow in your garden and you just kind of keep an eye on them. One thing you can do if you're doing a collaborative method is to cut the plants down before they go to seed if you don't want them to spread. If it's a plant that you're really enjoying its edible qualities, like maybe dandelion or purslane or quelites, maybe you can let it go to seed. And then it will appear for you again next season. I really believe in the collaborative method of working with weeds, but I will name that its disadvantage is that it's very time intensive and that you have to be in your garden a lot to make sure nothing gets out of hand. So I know that that's not available to everyone, and that's why I want to share a variety of methods. Another really great method is that you can prevent weeds. So if you see in this picture, we see somebody holding a really beautiful handful of mulch. Mulch you can get at landscaping stores, but another thing you can do is call your local tree company and see if you can get on their drop-off list. A lot of local tree companies, they don't want their mulch, and so they can actually like deliver a big load to your house if you get on their list. So that's a really great way to get mulch for free. But yeah, if you apply a really thick layer of mulch, like maybe at least like 4 to 6 inches over the soil, it's gonna do what weeds are trying to do, which is keep the soil covered and help keep moisture in. But it's also gonna make it really difficult for things to grow, like weeds to grow or even other plants. Mulch is also great because it can help feed mycorrhizae and the whole like fungus community. So I really love the strategy of mulch, especially if you don't have a ton of time or you have an area where you don't want to grow plants, but you also don't want weeds to show up. Another strategy for managing weeds is drip irrigation. One of the really great things about drip irrigation is that it targets where your water goes. And so you can focus on getting water to the plants that you want to grow versus if we're flooding or we're spraying water with a hose over a large area, that's going to give water to more plants and more weeds to have the opportunity to grow. So I love flooding. If you have access to an acequia, that is an amazing blessing. So by no means am I saying not to flood or not to use a hose, but that if you're really short on time, that using drip tape can save you some time in managing your weeds. I think the management the management strategy that we're all probably very familiar with is removal. So that's where we go in and we pull weeds. In this picture, you can see someone pulling some pigweed. You can see there's actually some purslane growing in there. I see one wild spinach growing in there. So I'd be curious if I could talk to this mysterious hand if they were just going to pull some of the weeds or leave some of them and do sort of a combination of removal and collaboration. That's sort of what I do at my house. Removal can also be hard, especially like getting down really low on the ground doesn't feel good to all of our bodies. It might not be accessible to all of us. So some other tools that you can use are like a hoe. A hoe lets you be standing to remove weeds. And they make these things called scuffle hoes. Sometimes they're called hula hoes, which the blade is actually like a loop of metal. And when you take it through the soil, you're kind of wiggling it back and forth, and it goes through and cuts the roots underneath the soil. And it lets you remain standing as you're weeding. So that can be a really great tool to invest in. But yeah, removal, it takes time. And the other thing I want to say with removal is that I love to compost my weeds, with the exception of weeds that have gone to seed. If I take weeds that have their seeds formed and put them in my compost pile, then when I put that compost in my garden, I'm just reintroducing all the seeds. Now, if you take your weeds to a really big composting facility like Soylutions, those compost piles get so hot that they are going to kill the seeds. So you can always take your weeds to a place like Soylutions instead of throwing them in the trash. That's a really great option. But yeah, the seed heads, because my home compost pile doesn't get hot enough, if I see the seed heads, I'm either going to take them to Soylutions or I'm going to put them in the garbage because I don't want to have those seeds in my soil year after year. And lastly, management strategies, natural herbicides. I'm going to strongly encourage folks not to ever put poison on their garden. The thing about an ecosystem is that nothing is isolated. So when you poison a plant or you poison bugs or rats or whatever you might be trying to treat with poison, those plants, those bugs, those rats, whatever it is, they're going to be consumed by other things. And those poisons are going to spread throughout the food web, as well as when it rains, those poisons are taken into our water systems. So I really want to see us move away from poison. But I see one reason that people use them is it saves a lot of time and energy versus say like pulling weeds. And so one strategy you can do that actually doesn't involve any chemicals but can kill your weeds is you can apply boiling water to them. The boiling water, just like that hot water will kill the plant. But know that it will kill any plant. So if you pour really boiling water on your silver nightshade that's growing right next to a tomato, it's going to kill both. So this management strategy is best used in an area that just has weeds that you're trying to get rid of. But this is my personal favorite, like natural herbicide, because it doesn't leave any residual chemicals in the soil. I know that sometimes folks will also use like vinegar or different kinds of soaps. I think those strategies are fine too, but they are going to affect your soil. And so I would really encourage just using boiling water. But of course, with the caveat that you have to be really careful so that you don't get burned, especially if you're walking with boiling water over an uneven surface. So some ways to reduce risk would be, say you have a pot this big, to only have boiling water up to a fourth or a half, so that when you're walking, it's not spilling out onto your hands and your body. Because the last thing we want is to get hurt in the garden. So that kind of wraps up our material for today. I see we're like 2 minutes over. So if you have to log out, I totally understand. But if you want to stay on for a few more minutes to do questions, I am happy to do that. And if there's no...
Hi there.
Yeah,
I just
hi.
want to say,
Oh, I'm losing your audio.
sorry about that. I have goat heads, I have the nightshade, I have the grass, I have everything. So I'm dealing with that. So I decided to make a couple of raised beds to be able
Okay.
to plant on one area. And I'm working on another area of the place. But thank you so much. I appreciate this very much.
You're so welcome. And I think I just want to affirm that's a really great strategy. If you have a ton of weeds and you're just not able to deal with them to plant directly, doing a raised bed that's on another level from those weeds is a really great strategy.
I'm learning about the soil, that I really have very poor soil in this area. I'm in
Mhm.
Rivera right now, and I moved to this area about 8 months ago. So
Okay.
I have a lot of
Yeah, I
work to
mean,
do.
one of my first farming teachers here in New Mexico used to say, in New Mexico and most places, we don't have soil, we have dirt. And so most of us growing in the high desert, we really have to give our soil a lot of care and love before it can really provide for the garden. But it sounds like your power of observation is really strong, and I think you're probably going to have a great season ahead.
Oh, thank you so much. I have my doubts some days. It's a lot of work ahead, but I want to do it.
Well, and if any questions come up for you in the future, I'm going to move ahead to our slide with our contact. So I'll leave that up before we log off, so you'll have time to write down our contact info. So if no one else has questions right now, I'm just going to move on. Before we log off, I wanted to let you know about our upcoming workshops. So next Saturday, same time, 11 to 12, we have some amazing people from our org who are teaching about regenerative agriculture and sort of like how to have healthy soil in your garden. So that's going to be an awesome presentation. And on April 12th, we're going to do a live Q&A session. We're still deciding if that's on Zoom or if that will be in person at Casa Barelas, but we will keep you posted. So we really hope to see you again. Of course, thank you for coming. And before we log out, this is our contact information of our really amazing team. We have a really wide array of skills and experience. And so if you send a question to one of us, even if we can't individually answer, as a team, we almost certainly can. So we'd love to be a resource for you in your season this year. And again, before I'm going to stop my screen share. But before we leave, I just want to remind you, if you want to access this information again, we will make a recording available on our YouTube. There's also last year's presentations, which were really amazing about similar subjects. And so that can be a resource for you going into your season. And so with all that said, I just want to thank you all so much for spending some of your Saturday with us in the Center of Southwest Culture. And happy gardening. If you want to come off your camera to say bye, I'd love to see your face. And if not, no problem.